theme of this session is transitions, continuities, and transformation. And what I'm going to look at is the transition from the colonial to the post-colonial, the breaks and the continuities. That's what the title of my paper is. There are broadly two major views on the subject of transition from the colonial to the post-colonial. The first is the colonial and neo-colonial view, which has the extreme sort of absurd argument is that colonialism led to rapid economic growth. Colonialism may not have led to rapid economic growth, but it created the conditions for the transition to capitalism. That is, the initial conditions for the transition or the takeoff to capitalism were created by colonialism. Now, these claims have increased rather than decreased over time, because one would have expected, with the powerful critique against the colonial position which started by the early nationalists in the 19th century and over a century of Marxist and nationalist writing all over the world, had, including, for example, Toru Matsui, we thought had ended this strand of thinking, but it did not. It has in fact resurfaced with a vengeance, partly because of the success of many of the countries which were earlier colonized. So the success of Southeast Asia, the success of South Asia, the success of East Asia is now connected with the fact that they were once a colony. So colonialism has now, it is now the claim of colonialism that the success of these regions is because of us. This is a position that I of course do not agree. The longest lasting legacy is, the question is where you look. If you look at the developing countries, fast developing countries, and you say that this is the legacy of colonialism, but the eye should be cast on other parts of the world, and also in these parts of the world, where you find that the longest lasting legacy is that of colonialism is that they leave behind a divided people. Whether you from Ireland to Africa to Latin America to the Middle East, wherever you go, and of course India, we are still trying to live down the legacy of religious division that has now made a comeback in our country, a colonial legacy. So this is one strand of argument. Now this colonial strand of argument also has a position on what happens after independence. So, for example, both Roy and Fergus and Meghnad Desai argue that while colonialism was very good, it led to growth, etc., etc., what happened immediately after independence was very bad. So the good was the globalization that occurred under colonialism, and then the neoliberal turn since 1991. And the bad was the Nehruvian, the Maoist, the Sukarno. It is these 30, 40 years which are the bad, which is the fly in the ointment. It is specifically said by Meghnad Desai, for example, that the first 40 years of India's independence were wasted years. So the independence and after, the decades after independence are seen as periods where there is a regression. So colonialism takes you forward, and then there is a regression with independence. This is the colonial and neo-colonial view which refuses to leave us. The colonial societies cannot, after their independence, move towards an independent economy so long as they do not shoot out of the world capitalist system into socialism. In other words, only socialism can lead to independent development. Now, once you have that argument and you have the empirical reality of countries like India, which did not go socialist, then you are in a problem. So they continue to therefore argue that the Indian situation is one where there is no independent development, because their theory had told them that unless you are socialist, you cannot be independent. The bourgeois democratic revolution, as they said, could only be led by the working class. Colonialism is bad, but then at least it gives you the railways, it gives you the education system, it gives you the civil service, is also a deeply flawed, logically deeply flawed argument. The instrument of your suppression cannot be treated as the residual benefit. If the railways is the instrument of the suppression and the distortion of the Indian economy, then you can't say at least you got the railways. Apart from the fact that the opportunity cost of building the wrong railways in the 19th century at a very high cost, so that now at a much higher cost you have to build the right railways, is amazing. So there is an opportunity cost which must be taken into account, and also the opportunity lost of not using the railways for the transition to industrialism, which is what Marx had thought the railways would do. It did not happen in the Indian case or in any other colonies case, such as you know, that India, China, and Egypt had their railways grow faster than they did in England, France, or any other European country. But these countries did not benefit from the making of the railways. There was no forward or backward linkages. There was no multiplier effect to the building of the railways in this country, which would lead to their industrialization. And the less one talked about the contribution of the civil service and the education system, the better. We are 70 years after independence still struggling to make the civil service civil, make it a service and not a dominant power. We are still struggling with an education system where we would like to take out the colonial constructs regularly brought on to us. The big picture that emerges from Angus Madison's figures, stupendous work that he has done of global economic history, confirms what I am saying. He shows that till the beginning of the 18th century, India was still the largest economy in the world, contributing about 25% of the world GDP, contributing 8 times the GDP of the United Kingdom. In the year 1800, India was contributing 8 times the GDP of the United Kingdom, and after 200 years of colonial development, quote-unquote development, in 1950, India's share comes down to only 4.2%, a small fraction of what West Europe was contributing to the world. The main point I'm going to make in this paper is that the developments in the post-independence period that we see are a contrast to what happens in the colonial period. If we took the last 3 or 4 decades of colonialism and contrasted it with the first 3 or 4 decades after independence, I think the argument becomes very clear. And the post-independence development that occurs, the statistics will show that this is actually a structural break. It is not a continuity that you're going to see. And also, the nature of the developments after independence are such that it belies the left CBF paradigm that we didn't have independent development after independence. Per capita income in the colonial period was either 0 or very low till about the First World War. The maximum it reached was 0.5%, the increase. The increase was 0.5%, otherwise it was more or less 0. Between 1913 to 1950, this is the critical period. Nearly the last 40 years of the colonial rule, there is a negative growth, if there is such a word. There is in fact a decline in per capita income at an annual average of 0.22% every year. The per capita income of the economy actually shrinks in this period. Contrast this with what happens after independence. Between 1950 and 1973, the so-called wasted years, according to both Meghnad Desai and Tirthankar Roy, is the period when per capita income increases at 1.4% per annum on an average, creating the conditions for the future growth. The unstructuring of colonialism happens in this period. It is something that we must remember that almost all the countries which have now entered the phase of globalization all needed these 30 or 40 years. China needed its Maoist phase before it opened up in 1978. Every country which has done that needed this period of unstructuring, because the fatal error this school of thought makes is that they combine or they collate the colonial globalization with the globalization that you are seeing in the second half of the 20th century. One occurs under colonialism and the other occurs under the rule of independent nation states. These are completely two different phases, two different kinds of globalization. What this 30 or 40 years period of colonial unstructuring does is to enable these third world countries to enter the globalization process with an advantage to itself, so that they do not disappear in the globalization process as only servers of the main of the metropolitan countries. That is, if in 1950s India had opened up, then we would have been in a banana republic. In the 1990s, when you open up, you are not a banana republic, because the period which they are calling the wasted years are indeed the period which created the conditions through which you could utilize the later entry into the global system. Now, I was giving you the statistics of the rates of growth. So from 1950 to 73, you have 1.4%, from 0 to 1.4, and from 73 to 2001, this is very significant, the rate of growth of per capita income is 3% per annum, which is higher, much higher than what it is in USA, UK, and even Japan. USA and UK grow at about 1.86%, France at 1.7%, and Japan at 2.4%, and India is growing at 3%. And this figure goes up even further if you come to the new millennium. Now you are having 2003 to 2007, you had per capita income growth rates of 7% per annum, which is the closest India ever came to the kinds of growth rates that Japan saw in the post-Second World War period. They had at that time 7 to 8% rate of growth, per capita income growth for about 20 years, which is what converted Japan from one of the developing countries to the second largest economy in the world. So this is not just a continuation of things as usual. This is something new that is happening. This is the overall economy. In agriculture, the shift is dramatic. The per capita agricultural output actually fell at the rate of 0.7% per year between 1911 and 1941. So the last 3 decades actually saw a fall. These are statistics very easily available from George Blynn's major study. Per capita food grain output fell even more sharply at about 1.14% annually. All crop yields, and particularly food grain yields per acre, also declined. So it's not only output, per capita output, but food grain yields also declined sharply at about 0.44% per year between 1921 to 1946. So it's not a surprise that we had famine conditions every year. Contrast this with the first 3 plans, where our bad boy Nehru, who's supposed to have ignored agriculture. Now what happens to agriculture in this period from 1947 to 64? Indian agriculture witnesses a growth rate of 3% per year, which is 8 times faster, 8 times, not 8%, 8 times faster than the growth rate that agriculture achieved in the colonial period from 1891 to 1946. So in that half century, the maximum growth rate that they could have was about 0.3%, and now it was over 3% per year. So agriculture underwent, and I'm not even giving you this Green Revolution figures, where it is even much, much higher. The yields per acre in the Green Revolution area sometimes increased by 12 times. I mean, I'm not even talking about that. Come to industry. The colonial period in the 19th century saw deindustrialization. The less we debated it, the better. The debate is over because often the 19th century guys, those who are talking of questioning deindustrialization, like Tirthankar Roy, give you statistics of the 20th century. But we are saying the 19th century is the period of deindustrialization. 20th century, we accept that there was an industrial growth. There the debate is, how does that industrial growth occur? Does it occur under colonial auspices or does it occur in confrontation? Professor Akita just gave you an example of the kinds of confrontation that were required. This rate cutting, which actually threw out Indian shipping from, which again, the Abdul Ghaffurs of the 17th and 18th centuries used to have a shipping capacity many times more than the East India Company. So from there you were brought to complete zero, not even in coastal trade. So it is in that kind of competitive situation, it is not the gift of colonialism that there is some amount of growth in the 20th century. Now, which is not very much. First World War to independence, the growth rate in industry was about 3.5% annually. From deindustrialization before that to 3.8% annually. Now compare that with what happens post-independence. 1951 to 65, the growth rates in industry are at about 7% per annum. But more important, it's not only the growth was substantive in the bad old days of Nehru, but the threefold increase in aggregate index of industrial production between 1951 and 1969 was the result of a 70% increase in consumer good industries, a quadrupling of intermediate good production, and a tenfold increase in the output of capital goods. So the point one is making is not only that there was industrial growth, the industrial growth was done in a manner largely through Nehru-Mahalanobis strategy, which would transform the structure of Indian industry altogether. And this is seen from the following results. The pattern of industrial development led to a structural transformation of the colonial legacy. From a situation where to make any capital investment, virtually the entire equipment had to be imported. In 1947, if you wanted to make any investment, at least 95% of that investment had to be with imported capital goods. We didn't, 90% of even machine tools like pliers and wrenches were also imported. So forget about machines, we made nothing. In other words, this is the typical neo-colonial situation. You have political independence, but no capacity to make any investment without help of capital goods from the very countries from whom you got independence. And that is what the wasted 40 years fixes. That's what Nehru fixed. So that the result was that while at independence you had to import 90% of the capital goods to make any investment, by 1960 you had to import only 43%. And by 1974, only 9%. By 1974, 90% or 91% of India's economic development could be managed. You could maintain your rates of growth on the basis of your own capacity to build capital goods. That is the secret of the success of India's independent foreign policy. No amount of diplomatic strategies and long speeches in the United Nations, 9 hours long by Krishna Menon, could have achieved this. This was a result of your having fixed your economy so that you could do it. And that is why India could, especially led by Indira Gandhi at that time, lead the non-aligned movement over 100 countries and cock a snook at the United States. That is why India remained one of the few countries, despite both the superpowers putting pressure on them, we could resist signing a completely unequal nuclear non-proliferation treaty, because you had enabled yourself through these initial protective years, created an autonomy to your economy. So this kind of growth also disabuses the other notion which the dependency school had, that post-independence development was neo-colonial dependent development. Post-colonial development is not neo-colonial independent development. It in fact destroys the structure of colonialism. Now the rate of capital formation in the first 50 years of independent India was 5 times higher than the rate achieved in the last 50 years of colonial rule. Again, suggesting a structural break. And the biggest break, perhaps, which is of great importance today, was the explosive shift in the area of scientific and technical knowledge. I'm calling it explosive because statistics do not make sense from it. When I will give you this, when you will see that there is a massive shift. This is an area which was deliberately left barren by the colonial rulers. Science and technology was not welcome. The 3 R's, language, arithmetic, were okay. If you look at the first plan, and Kaustav, correct me if I'm wrong, what shocks you is that there is no big talk of steel plants and dams and this, that, and the other. The first plan is all about building your IITs, your National Physical Laboratory, your Bhabha Atomic Research Center, every conceivable institution, your Sangeet Natak Academy, every conceivable institution that we know about today were created in the 1950s. This is Nehru's anticipating the post-industrial knowledge revolution. One reason why India is anywhere in the picture, because we missed the first industrial revolution, the second one, we missed the Second World War, provided the opportunity of industrialization which Australia and Canada took advantage of. We missed all those boats, and Nehru was sure that he didn't want to miss the information technology revolution. And the result was that the national expenditure on scientific and technical manpower increased from 10 million rupees in 1949 to 4.5 billion in 1977. It's a several hundred times increase. That's why I said it's explosive. And the result was that by the 1970s, India had the third largest manpower in the world in the area of science and technology. The fact that we didn't get all the benefit of it, primarily through brain drain and other issues, is another matter. But the point is that we did create that manpower. So in sum then, if I can summarize in 2 minutes, the transition from colonial to post-colonial is marked by the breaks. It's marked by the breaks consciously articulated, and a major role was played by Nehru, the bad boy. And the transition is not marked by the continuities in the economic sphere. So that's the one major generalization I want to make, that the transition is marked by the breaks. The second is that the continuities are unfortunately in the areas of society. As I said earlier, the longest lasting legacy of colonialism has been that it has left behind a divided people. Wherever colonialism has gone, it has left behind a divided people. As I said, whether it is Ireland, whether it is India, whether it is the Middle East, Africa, it has left behind a divided people on the basis of caste, religion, in other situations race, in other situations language, in other situations subdivisions of religion, Catholics and Protestants. These divisions in our societies continue, and the tools with which these divisions are being promoted are still colonial. These divisions were started by colonialism. The tools they employed, such as separate electorate, are the demands that are now coming up. The tools they employed, a particular kind of reservation, are all coming back. We are using the same methodology which the colonials taught you to divide your own people. It is the easiest thing, it appears, after having studied colonialism for the last so many decades, is the easiest thing to overthrow is political domination. The more difficult thing is the overthrow of the economic domination. That is, you've got independence, but your economy is structured in a dependent manner with the advanced countries. But the most difficult, obviously, is the removal or the getting rid of the colonization of the mind. And that is why we teach. The proof of that is that 70 or 75 years after independence, we teach Tirthankar Roy in the best university in the country, undergraduate university, Delhi University. This is why virtually the entire educated middle class in India vies with each other to voluntarily migrate to the West. and thus contribute to the process of colonial surplus appropriation. What is now being taken away is not through slavery, forced slavery. It is not being taken away through indentured labor. It is by voluntary migration, and therefore we say there is no colonialism. Colonialism is not about export of manufactured goods and import of raw materials, which we were taught in class 5 and which gets repeated. Colonialism is about taking away whatever is at that point of historical time the critical factor of production. The critical factor of production in the 17th century, 15th century, 16th century was land and labor. So they grabbed other people's land and called it discovery. They grabbed other people's labor and took them away as slaves. Colonialism in the 19th century was where the critical factor of production was capital. And what you saw was therefore massive migration of capital from the colony to the advanced countries, what our nationalists call the drain. So that India financed 84% of British investment at the time when it was the fastest growing country in the world. In 1801, 84% of the gross domestic capital formation of Britain was financed by Indian drain. So that was the transfer of capital. Today, the critical factor of production is knowledge. And since the 1960s, we've been handing over the best minds of the country to the West, as I said, voluntarily, thinking we are doing a great job for us and our children, but are actually participating in the colonization of our country. I'll just end with one statistics. This is not my statistics, not nationalist JNU statistics. This is American statistics, okay? 95% of the Indians who go to the United States to get a PhD in science, technology, medicine, engineering, stay there. So forget about this trickle-down theory, that they're going but they're coming back. 95% stay there. In 1960s, that is the time we first created our engineers and doctors. It took about 15 years. This mass migration started. At that time, only 14% of American PhDs were by non-Americans. Today, in 2015, 40% of American PhDs in high technology areas are by non-Americans. 2 out of 5 are your Asians, Indians, and Chinese and others. So while the United States, I'm giving you as an example, rakes it in, you hand it out and you think it is success. This is the colonization of the mind. So the struggle, friends, I believe, is not the success is in the breaks, and the future struggle is to undo the continuities. Thank you.